enslaved in the US, which under international human rights law would be considered a gross human rights violation. This has never been fully examined, accounted for, or assessed at the national level. Chattel slavery reduced Black people to the status of property, subjecting them to horrific violence and unspeakable cruelty. For enslaved women and girls in particular, that trauma included grotesque sexual violence and abuses, which are also gross human rights violations, which enforce white male supremacy and gender hierarchy. And the trauma of this violence and cruelty has been passed down in a variety of ways through generations, which will be the bulk of our discussion today of how reparative justice not only accounts for economic harms, but psychological and social harms as well. So specifically, we know that scientists for decades have been studying epigenetics, have found that trauma experienced by parents can impact the DNA and the behavior of their offspring for generations to come. One study conducted on worms in particular found the residual impacts of trauma lasting for 14 generations. Of course, studies, including peer-reviewed studies that have looked at impacts on humans, particularly studies that looked at trauma impacts on Holocaust survivors, have identified epigenetic trauma and also intergenerational trauma that increase the amount of risk for high anxiety disorders, PTSD, and other disorders, attention deficit disorders. For the Black community in particular, the impact of centuries of unaddressed trauma still manifests today. And while part of that is certainly due to ongoing social injustice, some of that impact is very well inherited. So you have experts saying that systemic racism is leaving Black people with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, harm to their immune systems, premature aging. In Washington, DC alone, life expectancy rates are a staggering 15 years shorter than white residents. All while Black people are less likely than white people to have access to mental health services and more likely to receive poor quality of healthcare. When you think about how these impacts manifest to even more detrimental conditions, the suicide rate for Black children is rising faster for any other ethnic group and is the second leading cause of death for Black youth aged 10 to 19. So, you know, my ancestors, as a Black woman, my ancestors have lived through this, and it's a compounded trauma that you can experience through present day experiences as a result of systemic racism. And so I hope today in our conversation, when we talk about comprehensive reparations and what it has to address and rectify, obviously there have been barriers to wealth accumulation, to social mobility in this country, to political participation, but there's been psychological harms too. And that is often what you can't see, but is often what is most impactful over generations. So we're talking again about a diaspora of people that for centuries were beaten, brutalized, exploited, raped, deprived of basic human rights, and then were supposedly freed from that system, but into systems of racial terror and violence, of economic and political disenfranchisement, incarceration, coupled with racism in the workplace, racism in schools, and deprivation of key resources to survive. So it doesn't get much more traumatic than that. And local and state governments and the federal government have a responsibility to account for and remedy these types of harms. In May, I want to transition into what will be sort of our case study of today in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And in May, just before the centennial, which marked 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, one of the worst incidents of domestic terrorism in this country, or a racial incident of racial violence. I had the honor of testifying alongside the 3 known living survivors of the massacre. And I want to take some time to read you some of their words from the survivors' testimony, just so that you can feel the accounts of trauma that they had to relive while pleading for justice, their humanity, and ultimately for reparation. So these are the words of Mother Viola Ford Fletcher, who is 106. She's revered in the community as Mother Fletcher. She says, "I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies laying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot." Next, I want to read the words of Mother Leslie Benningfield Randall, who is 106, who is known in the Tulsa community as Mother Randall. "It was like a war. White men with guns came and destroyed my community. We couldn't understand why. What did we do to them? We didn't understand. We were just living, but they just came and they destroyed everything. They burned houses and businesses. They just took what they wanted out of the buildings, then they burned them. They murdered people. We were told they just dumped the dead bodies in the river. I remember running outside of our house. I ran past dead bodies. It wasn't a pretty sight. I still see it in my mind today, 100 years later." These are the words of Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, who is 101. He was only 6 months old during the massacre. He is the baby brother of Mother Viola Fletcher, but he is also a World War II veteran. So you can only imagine the compounded trauma that he's experiencing. "My name is Hughes Van Ellis. I am 100 years old, and I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Because of the massacre, my family was driven from our home. We were left with nothing. We were made refugees in our own country. I did my duty in World War II. I served in combat in the Far East with the 234th AAA Gun Battalion. We were an all-Black battalion. I fought for freedom abroad, even though it was ripped away from me at home, even after my home and my community were destroyed. I did it because I believed in the end America would get it right. When I returned home from war, I didn't find any of the freedom I was fighting for overseas. Unlike white servicemen, I wasn't entitled to GI benefits because of the color of my skin. I came home to segregation, a separate and unequal America, but I still believed in America." I wanted to take the time to read those 3 testimonies. Obviously, those are the words of the survivors. And if you have not had a chance to see their testimonies in front of Congress, I really implore you to hear them, as some of the survivors wept as they spoke these words. But this kind of pain and trauma cannot just be magically wiped away. And clearly, over 100 years old, centenaries testifying in front of Congress are still carrying the weight of this massacre on them as they try to convince government authorities, try to convince the public that my psychological pain matters. And there's someone responsible for this pain, and someone needs to account for it. In May 2020, I produced a report for Human Rights Watch ahead of the 99th mark of the Tulsa Race Massacre to basically lay out the case for reparations there, a more comprehensive case. There was a 2001 state legislature commission that recommended reparations, including financial compensation and enterprise, an economic enterprise zone, scholarships for students that were impacted by the massacre, as well as proper burial and identification of potential victims found in unmarked mass graves. But in addition to that, the Black community today is still reeling from the impacts of the massacre. And my colleagues, building off of my colleagues' research in Tulsa, documenting how policing, poverty, and racial inequality plays out in Tulsa. I mean, this was the foundation for that type of work because we saw clear disparities in food access, in healthcare, in access to education, which were primarily in areas of North Tulsa where higher populations of Black people live and where most Greenwood residents were displaced to once they returned back to Greenwood post the massacre. In terms of the massacre itself, it was a devastating event. You had over 1,200 homes destroyed. You had libraries destroyed. You had schools destroyed, hospitals destroyed, a dozen churches destroyed. So we're talking about an entire community of people, not just Black Wall Street, which people refer to Greenwood as most commonly, which I believe minimizes the city within the city that Greenwood was. We're talking about a full range of community resources in a prosperous, wealthy economic hub for Black people by Black people. That means people were robbed billions of dollars of wealth. The most recent estimates reach into the billions of dollars for damages, just property damages alone, let alone, other material damages and moral damages. But this massacre left 8,000 to 10,000 Black Tulsans homeless. At the height of Greenwood, prior to the massacre, 11,000 Black Tulsans lived in Greenwood. And so we're talking about up to 10,000 people displaced, as well as an estimated 300 killed, mostly Black. Obviously, there's a ongoing search for mass graves as we speak, which will, render whatever truth is possible based off of eyewitness accounts that said, I saw charred bodies dumped into these graves. And those were testimonies taken by the 2001 Commission's work and people who tried to come forward, right? We're talking about a massacre that was suppressed for decades and intentionally suppressed, not only by the government, but the Black folks who survived it also didn't want to talk about it. And they didn't want to talk about it for a couple reasons. One being the trauma that it invoked to even relive that experience. But two, because white supremacist violence was still actively operating in Tulsa and in Oklahoma more broadly. You had the chapter of the KKK arising to its biggest potential just shortly after the massacre occurred. Even prior to the massacre, they were laying the groundwork for what would ultimately be an attempt to extinguish Black Tulsans from the Greenwood community and from Tulsa more broadly. A lesser known fact about the massacre is that after the massacre, those then almost 10,000 Black Tulsans, now many people fled, and only 40% of Greenwood residents actually ever came back to the rebuilding phase. Most of the rebuilding actually had to come from help from other all Black towns in Oklahoma. It wasn't just, the resources that Greenwood residents could pick up, because most of those resources were depleted and their claims were denied by the courts because of riot exception clauses that were invoked by the insurance companies. Riot clauses that still exist on the books today in many different insurance companies. But the lesser known fact about Black Tulsans being rounded up into internment camps, ushered down to various parts of the city by the National Guard. They were forced to wear green identification cards and could only leave the camps if a white employer claimed them. So we're talking about 7,500 identification tags produced by the city government to make sure that those Black Tulsans knew they were not human, knew that they could only be possessed if valued by another white person. We've heard that story before, right? In other countries. We've heard that story before in other places during other atrocities. And so I hope that's not lost on folks in terms of even the conditions of those internment camps. You had the Red Cross having to provide disaster relief because the city government and the state government refused to do so, including blocking actual relief, medical relief, and financial relief into Tulsa in the immediate aftermath. So the Red Cross, which historically had intervened on international conflicts, was coming domestically within the United States to provide disaster relief. And while they tried their best, those camp conditions were terrible: malnutrition, lack of access to sanitation. You had a number of stillborn and premature births, so stillborn deaths and premature births. So we're talking about, the trauma on also Black mothers being intergenerationally passed down. Life was lost, not only by burning people alive, killing them in the streets, burning people in their homes, lynching people, but also in these camps when there was supposed to be some repair and recovery. So no one was ever prosecuted for the violence and destruction continued to today. Neither the city nor the state has provided restitution. And one of the points of our May 2020 report was not just to re-up those 4-5 key recommendations by the state legislature in 2001, but also to expand that based off of our interviews and our community relationships with descendants and with the survivors. There was a clear need for additional remedy. In international human rights law, there's a legal and moral requirement to provide reparations for incidents of racial violence, such as the Tulsa Race Massacre, and for policies that are connected to the legacy of slavery, like redlining, urban renewal, highway construction, race-based zoning. And the community really spoke to these psychological harms. And so needing a trauma-informed care system, some type of free trauma-informed care benefits would be of a proportional remedy. As articulated in international human rights law, the remedy has to be as proportional to the harm as possible. Now, in many cases of gross human rights violations, the harm is vast. And there, at this point, especially for the legacy of enslavement and colonialism, we may never see a full and proportional remedy to account for the cumulative harms that have occurred. However, there should be an attempt to administer as many remedies as possible specific to the harms experienced to bring a community back to a place that it was prior to the violation. So in addition to financial compensation and proper burial of remains, we also recommended free trauma-informed care. We recommended targeted investments in housing and land acquisition. We recommended, targeted investments in Black entrepreneurship and economic development. We also recommended, scholarships based off of the fact that now you have Oklahoma State University Tulsa Satellite Campus, as well as Langston University Tulsa Satellite Campus that now occupy the historic Greenwood District boundaries. So in terms of the people who have been impacted by the massacre, why shouldn't they be able to go to those schools for free? Those universities displaced hundreds of businesses and residential homes. And so what is the remedy for that type of economic development that ultimately continues to create race and class barriers? In Tulsa, if you've ever been to Greenwood, you'll see the Interstate 244 highway running through the heart of the Greenwood Center. That divides Greenwood physically, that divides Tulsa and Greenwood physically, with Black populations relegated to poverty and lack of resources to the north of that highway boundary, and then higher medians of wealth and populations of white people to the south of that highway. So that's indicative of many different cities across the US, though. As we know, highways have always, in addition to railroad tracks and other infrastructure systems, being built to divide people on race and class lines. So this trauma, again, suppressed for decades, people living still with it today. There's an active civil lawsuit to provide some restitution for not only the physical and economic harms, but also the psychological harms. I wanna quickly just, as I'm closing out my presentation, I would love to define more broadly what the right to remedy and reparation is as defined in international human rights law. Some folks are like, why does this apply to the United States? Well, it's a legal standard applicable to the United States because we've signed, 2 international treaties that provide this right to victims. And so it is not lost, it should not be lost on any of us that we should demand of our communities, demand of our local, state, and federal government authorities that they have the responsibility and the requirement to provide full redress for these types of harms. Most people, when we talk about reparation, is mostly a conversation about financial compensation. And while financial compensation should absolutely be measured, to the extent there's, economically accessible damage and moral loss and loss of opportunity, which is also calculable. An Australian High Court granted Indigenous communities financial compensation for their loss, their spiritual loss and connection to land, which was calculable by the court. But financial compensation is not the only form of reparation, and we shouldn't diminish that as just one form. At times that needs to be accompanied with another form, many other forms of remedy, depending on what the human rights violation is. So human rights law gives you a roadmap of what this looks like. So restitution, restoring a community back to a morally acceptable place. That means a return of artifacts, a return of land, return of property, return of opportunity in whatever forms that should include. Financial compensation, we talked about, rehabilitative measures. So these are the medical and psychological services that are needed to restore communities back to a place where there's not intergenerational pain indefinitely. We have descendants and survivors alive today from the Tulsa Race Massacre that can speak directly to this lived psychological harm. There's a search for mass graves right now, and many community members are wondering, maybe that's where my family member went because they never knew. And as someone who was born in Tulsa, my parents, I did not grow up there, but my parents were mentored by many of the survivors. And they always talked about not knowing who went where, not knowing where their neighbors went, and being very hard to believe that only 300 people were killed out of a population of 11,000, where there was, just mass death and displacement. So that's rehabilitation. Then you have satisfaction measures, memorials, official apologies, truth-telling measures. How can we incorporate this into an education curriculum where it's not whitewashed, or where it's telling the details in various disciplines? There's also what we call guarantees of non-repetition, which is ensuring that these abuses do not happen again. How do we ensure not another race massacre occurs? How do we ensure that not another police killing occurs? How can we ensure that not another, act of housing discrimination occurs? That may require institutional and legal reforms. That may require institutional reimagining. Some institutions, as we know it, so culturally, we are, we're embedded in the systems too. We think, oh, they're functioning for all of us, but really they were built up, some were built up to only serve a certain group of people and subjugate another group of people. And so if we are living under this auspices of equal opportunity, then how can we do that when institutions have been built up not to serve and not to deliver equal opportunity? Our legal systems have not provided reparative justice and restitution for these types of incidents of racial violence. The Rosewood Race Massacre victims also tried to seek legal remedy. Tulsa Race Massacre survivors have failed legal remedy attempts going all the way back to 1921, but in most recently, the early 2000 lawsuit. Our court system is set up to say, I'm sorry this atrocity happened, but because you didn't come to us within 2 years or 5 years, we can't hear this case on its merits. And so that's what's happened in many cities across the US with victims of these types of incidents, not being able to even seek remedy, not even being able to have the court hear the arguments on their merits, even if the court recognizes that this would be the one of the cases that we would make an exception, that we would explore equitable toll on. Regardless, the legal system is not set up to provide justice for historic injustices that have created present day harm. And I just want to emphasize that again, any type of reparations program has to be comprehensive. The federal government has paid reparations before. We had actually one of the first cases of reparation coming at the end of the 1800s through the Compensated Emancipation Act, which granted reparations to white slaveholders when that also declared Black enslaved people free. That reparation compensated them for their loss of human property. In the 40s, you had what was called the National Indian Claims Commission, which granted Native and Indigenous folks some land back, some claims back. Obviously, that was not proportional to the harms and the range of crimes of mass killing, displacement, and violence. However, it was an attempt by the federal government to try to rectify these wrongs. And in addition, they issued an official apology thereafter. And as you can see, there's some other efforts to expose the truth around, school board policies and such by the Department of Interior. We also had the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which passed, granting reparations to Japanese Americans and others that were incarcerated during World War II. That package included financial benefits, historical memory benefits, as well as pardons for wartime relocation crimes that people were charged with for their resistance to wrongful incarceration. So when you think about how expansive a reparations package could be, and especially when you're thinking about the legacies of enslavement and colonialism, you're definitely thinking, okay, well, in addition to financial compensation, historical memory, preservation of spaces, there are, in the news, I'm hearing like every other month that there's some mass grave, unmarked mass grave of Black folks in various cities. But in addition to that, thinking about criminal expungement, thinking about all the various criminal legal system charges that disproportionately impact Black people, and many people who are sitting in jail cells and prison cells today that are wrongfully incarcerated, and they're needing to be pardons and expungements of those records, which ultimately impact your human rights when you are reentering into society. Your ability to seek housing, your ability to seek a job, your ability to seek healthcare is all impacted by if you were formerly incarcerated. Lastly, I want to point to kind of how other Chicago has dealt with psychological harm, and how victims of the Holocaust also receive some type of psychological benefit in health-based benefit post the traumas of the Holocaust. In Chicago in particular, I find that as one of the most comprehensive examples of reparations that we have in the US, which is really extraordinary. So there was a police torture ring led by Chicago Police Commander John Burge and what he called his Midnight Crew in the 70s and the 80s. Primarily, over 120 folks, predominantly Black folks, including women, pregnant women and children, being tortured by the police over these couple of decades. Years later, they had been pushing, there was a large grassroots movement that was existent for decades, but finally decades later, they administered a comprehensive reparations package, financial compensation, education curriculum in Chicago high schools that teach about the police torture ring, but also teach about why reparations were necessary in this case. In addition to that, victims and their families have access to free college tuition in the Chicago city colleges. But in addition to that, what I love about this reparations package is the Chicago Torture Justice Center, which was established as a part of the reparations package. And that basically created a center on the South Side with the abilities to address the psychological harms connected to police torture. And so that's something that I would love to see on not only for Tulsa Race Massacre victims, but also at the broader scale for descendants of enslaved Africans in the US, and what reparatory justice would look like for them, which through HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act, a federal commission that would investigate the legacy of slavery and then come up with repair proposals. I can see that being one of the outcomes of that commission's work, given the compounded psychological traumas that are experienced not just from the system of chattel slavery itself, but Jim Crow segregation, war on drugs, mass incarceration, lack of equal access to education, housing discrimination, and police violence, and so on. Also, when at the end of World War II, you had nearly 500,000 Jewish people surviving the Holocaust, which was remarkable. But of course, a number of these people immigrated to Israel in two main periods, but also an estimated 200,000 survivors now still living there, many of whom are elderly, are receiving end-of-life care, and are also, there was a even more harm was administered post the Holocaust, where a number of the survivors were repeatedly and chronically hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals. Many of those survivors stayed in those hospitals for long periods of time, which could have either treated those harms properly or created more harm, just given how some of our psychiatric wards do function. But that still is an example of a comprehensive reparations package in consultation with the German government and the claims conference, really taking a step back to assess what harms actually need to be remedied here. There's definitely critique of why the financial compensation did not account for psychological harm on its face, and more so just for displacement. But those are things to think about when we're thinking about what reparative justice looks like. How do we restore communities back to a place where, I struggle with this concept of wholeness, because when people have been subjugated from the beginning, it's hard to imagine what that restoration looks like. However, there was a place where we all existed in a without systems of oppression, and we existed maybe in our own spaces until colonialism reached across the country. And across the world. But there is an opportunity here, as reparations efforts are popping up all over the country in various cities and institutions, as the federal government is being pushed to stand up this HR 40 Reparations Commission, as the state of California is doing the work of a HR 40 commission, but at the state level, investigating crimes related to enslavement and thereafter on Black Californians, and then coming up with repair proposals. It's imperative that we are having these conversations, but we're also putting forth plans of action that do not neglect the psychological harms that victims of human rights violations are experiencing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And would you like to now transition into Q&A?
Absolutely.
All right. If any audience members have any questions, please use the reactions to raise your hand and or submit your question in the chat. Okay, Dr. Vernita Perkins has raised hand.
Hi. I'm virtually speechless. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this plenary session. I wish that every single member of SCRA could have been here. And I want to just say to everyone in the room, and this passes on to everyone in SCRA, in the APA divisions and beyond. Now, do you understand what we were talking about in the emails on the listserv in 2020? When there was so much defensiveness and so much self-interest and so much center staging, this is what we meant. And I cannot stress it enough that no matter what atrocities that have been done, and we look at them every week, we study them every week, to all the people on this planet, United States citizens must understand that Black people still are seen as inhuman. And these things still continue socially and state sanctioned, and by the global view of still seeing people with dark skin and textured hair as less human. Thank you again for doing this.
Thank you so much.
I see a raised hand. Megan?
Yeah, I also just noticed that Dr. Meeks has an icon up. I don't know if that was meant to be a hand. Okay, I just wanted to make sure to recognize that if that was what that was. Thank you, Teresa, so much for joining us today. Glad that you're able to share, and thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing. I know you were so active with the Tulsa work over the last few months and with the Legislative Coalition. I would love for you to share with us, just from the Public Policy Council angle, to tell us a little bit about where HR 40 is at right now and sort of the critical moment, any ways that you would recommend folks could lend their voices to that effort. Would love to hear from you on that.
Thank you, Megan, and have really appreciated Megan's support in our HR 40 coalition and bringing this perspective into the space. And I just really feel very passionately about community health, community psychologists being in this space. Like, there is no way that you cannot be in the work of repair. If you are able to identify these harms and the atrocities, we have to identify a way forward. And that includes what repair mechanisms are needed. So in terms of HR 40, we are at a critical moment, as Megan said. Because of the, kind of political world around midterms and approaching midterms, as you've seen, a number of, landmark civil rights bills are being, considered and stalled in the Senate, as well as, not totally agreed upon in the House. But we're at a point where, HR 40 has the most momentum it has ever had in its 32-year history. It was first introduced actually after the Civil Liberties Act was signed into law by then Ronald Reagan. So there was some hope that, okay, maybe America is ready to, repair the harms related to the legacy of enslavement. Maybe we're just willing to even have that conversation, because HR 40 does not even, give the actual reparations. It just discusses what this might look like based off of research and full investigation into the harms. So right now, 190 co-sponsors in the House, an incredible amount. There's 220 Democrats in the entire caucus. We are still pushing for Republican support. You have 22 co-sponsors in the Senate, but we're also pushing for a vote pre-August recess. So the last day of votes in the calendar is July 30th. And why this is important is because there are reparations efforts happening as I said earlier, at the institutional, local, and state level. California modeled its bill after HR 40 and has stood up its commission before the federal government has. And that has given kind of some pause to citizens, to people in the US who are saying, okay, well, are these things reparations? Are those things reparations? They're trying to put things together because the federal government still hasn't accounted for slavery being a national policy, redlining being a national policy, urban renewal programs being national policy. In addition to all of the institutions, Federal Housing Administration, Department of Education, that have started from racially discriminatory origins. The USDA, I mean, we can go down DOJ, we could go down each institution in its origins. So it's a critical time to stand up a federal reparations commission as the country is reckoning. I mean, there's no coincidence that attacks on teaching racism in this country are coming at the same, and voter disenfranchisement bills are coming at the same times where the reparations movement has been at its highest point. And that's why we have to keep pushing through and pushing through the muck, because most of it is, idiocracy anyway, and conflation with academic ideas and theories that you don't even learn until you're like maybe in a special college program, but definitely more so graduate. You don't learn critical race theory until you're probably in graduate school. So all of these myths, you know, that's the legacy of white supremacy in this country. And that's why also it's so imperative just for the truth to come out, even through this HR 40 Reparations Commission, and for the House to vote on this. It just got its first historic vote in the Judiciary Committee in April, in 32 years. If it does not pass out of the House this year, you know, we have to all do some internal work to ensure that repair is actually a part of our pathway to dismantling structural and systemic racism, and actually making a community and country that is towards the pathway of healing. You can't get to racial justice. You can't get to closing the racial equity gaps if you have not repaired past harms that have current and present day implications. So thank you for that question, Megan. We welcome folks to join, you know, our coalition, get active, get involved. We're actively in lobbying meetings to get these final yes votes for the floor. We are also pushing for additional co-sponsorship the bill until that is closed off. But then we need commitments from the remaining members in Congress to vote yes. The last thing I'll say is you saw the Juneteenth bill pass out of the House 415 to 14, okay? And whatever ploy that was to undermine HR 40, we're gonna use that to our advantage, because if you can acknowledge the significance of Juneteenth, then you can, that means that you understand something needs to be addressed here. There are some harms that need to be addressed and repaired. And so that's the messaging that we are launching off with. We would love to see a 415 to 14 vote on HR 40. The realities of that, maybe, you know, not so much, but we sure are gonna push for it. In terms of action pages, you're welcome to go to Human Rights Watch's Reparations Now action page, hrw.org/reparations now. I can type that in the chat. There are plenty of other resources. We have an amazing, amazing coalition of over 350 organizations working towards this. So I just want to implore you, you know, even if you do a quick Google search of HR 40, I'm sure you will see the number of organizations. Definitely, yes, definitely reach out to Megan and get in touch with our movement towards justice and movement towards repair.
Andres, we have a question in the chat from Rome Meeks. What are some of the excuses you have heard for why reparations should not be granted, whether financial or otherwise?
Yeah, well, I mean, so, and I want to be clear, like here today, we've been talking about reparations for the legacy of enslavement. And obviously there are victims of human rights violations for many different varying human rights violations. And that may target specific communities, disabled communities, Latinx communities, other communities. So I just want to just make that clear. In terms of reparations for enslavement, there's always, this retreat to individualism. My family didn't own slaves. Why should I do this? Well, slavery was a national policy. We don't have, we're not going to go down that line. It's not about your family, even though your family may have owned slaves, but it's about a government sanctioned system that has continued to oppress people today. And that's where the focus is. There's also questions always about feasibility. How are we going to pay for all of this? Well, how do we pay for all of our wars? How do we pay for all of the police lawsuits? How do we pay, come on now. When we have to pay for Republicans doing stunts at the border, those are our taxpayer dollars. So if you don't know where your taxpayer money is going now, you should probably do some research. And maybe, just maybe, you might want some of those dollars. And that's if we have to go that route. There are some innovative, compensation funds that have been set up to where you're taking, money out of the cannabis tax revenue. There are innovative ways to do this, but a tax-based approach may be one of those ways. But the way we use our tax dollars today, why not use those dollars to create healing in our communities if we're going to use them at all? There's a number of different resistance to, I would say those are two of the greatest ones. There's also this sort of non-understanding of how enslavement still impacts people today and how that legacy still continues. It's hard for them to draw a line between 1619 and present day. And there's so much incredible research, qualitative research, storytelling that speaks directly to this. If we're talking about, lack of access to wealth accumulation, that starts with, land acquisition. That starts with displacement, dispossession of Black farmers' land. That starts with the Homestead Acts, doling hundreds of millions of acres of land to mostly white people in the West, which created expansion across the US. That can be tied to banking discrimination today. The same slave blocks that are Wall Street, where the most prominent banks are the same people denying people mortgage loans, personal loans, savings and checkings accounts to Black people today. So these things are not disconnected. We've talked about the psychological harm that can't be disconnected, and that is passed down intergenerationally.
So we are approaching time. And so just I don't see any more questions in the chat. There were some about some of the references that you mentioned. Let's see. And thank you, Megan, for putting in the chat some resources that people can follow up on to learn more. And you had mentioned international human law that supports the rights to reparations of victims. Marika would love for you to share the name and the reference of that law, if you have that available.
Yes, I just put in the Case for Reparations report I authored in May 2020. It has a international legal section in it. I implore you to go there, but also here is the basic principles document that is, largely what constitutes within the international law space. The Right to Remedy and Reparation Resource Basic Guidelines page.
And I see another question in chat. Are there other initiatives in this space that HR Watch is engaged in?
Yeah, I mean, our work spans across criminal legal system and immigration system and all the intersections, primarily because, so to do this work with care, you don't want to spread yourself over so many different issues. We have provided technical assistance to a number of city councils and governments, state governments that are thinking about reparations programs. Tulsa is really, a community that we're dedicated to supporting from here throughout until they receive the justice they deserve. The national fight is obviously a long fight. That may include, thinking about what direct proposals are necessary. So how do we start thinking about in talking, going to communities first, because reparations is a victim-centered approach. It's not something that governments can say, here's your reparations, we decided what y'all needed. No, there has to be an extensive consultation process with people impacted and affected from start to finish. Those recommendations should reflect as much as possible the range of people that are harmed. And so even at the national level, there's discussions to be had. Okay, we have HR 40, a commission that will come up with these various proposals, but how can we start going to communities today and start thinking about what a direct reparations proposal looks like for psychological harms? How can we start to think about that and draft legislation around that so that we are not stalling progress if the political establishment is resistant just to a commission alone?
Well, I want to just thank you for coming and just sharing so much knowledge. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chats, but so much of a positive response to your talk and this conversation. And so just thank you for being willing to join us in this space. Everyone, this concludes our presentation, and please be on the lookout for some follow-up things to learn more about how to be involved, as well as we do have a potential U.S. reparations interest group as well. So just want to make sure to plug those items. And I hope everyone is enjoying the biennial and continue to enjoy the presentation. So thank you everyone for your time and presence.
Thank you so much. Take good care.